to today's webinar. I'm starting the recording and I'm going to hand it off to Paula to start us off. Paula, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. My name's Paula Allen. I'm the Vice President of Programs and Advocacy here at Alive. Welcome to the February Alive Academy webinar for 2021, No One Right Way, Imagining New Systems for Volunteer Engagement. I'm so pleased that you all decided to join us today for this important topic on examining our volunteer engagement systems and the Minnesota Association for Volunteer Administration's recent efforts at making many different ways a norm in volunteerism. Brief overview of our agenda for today. We'll deal with some housekeeping notifications and I'll do the introduction for our speaker. We're here for the presentation, then we'll have time for questions and discussion afterwards. And stay tuned at the end of the webinar to learn more about upcoming Alive Academy sessions. If you're having trouble with audio visio today, you've got options. You can keep us streaming in video on your computer, but call in from your phone with audio only. If you're having trouble with your bandwidth, sometimes calling in by phone can help. Put any other tech support questions you might have in the chat box to presenters only, and Gretchen will help sort you out. Speaking of the chat box, if you want to talk to all the attendees, please make sure that you choose that function first. Otherwise, you're talking to just Gretchen and I, and we want to encourage you to chat with each other and share your experience. Gretchen and I will be monitoring questions as we go along today, and we'll be sending the slide deck out to attendees after the presentation. I could not be more pleased to introduce Lisa Joycelyn, the Equity and Inclusion Manager at the Minnesota Association for Volunteer Administration, MAVA. Her work is focused on learning how to address systemic inequities in volunteer engagement systems to better engage communities of color as volunteers at nonprofit and government organizations. Lisa has worked in the field of volunteer engagement for nearly 15 years, including 4 years as the Volunteer Services Officer for the Red Cross Minnesota region and positions at multiple volunteer centers. She holds a Master's of Public Policy from the University of Minnesota, and I'm thrilled for her presentation today. I'll turn it over to Lisa and we'll get started. Lisa, take it away.
All right, great. I'm just going to share my screen here. What did I just... Sorry. Okay. You'd think after all this time, I just clicked something weird and it's okay. Sorry.
No worries.
After all this time, I would be a expert on Zoom, but alas, here we are. Now I'm going to share my screen.
There you are. You're good, Lisa. We can
Okay, awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me today. Again, my name is Lisa Joycelyn. My pronouns are she, her, and I am with MAVA, the Minnesota Association for Volunteer Administration. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about No One Right Way, Imagining New Systems for Volunteer Engagement. So I'm going to kick it off by telling you just a little bit about MAVA and the work that I've been doing around inclusive volunteerism and race equity in volunteerism. So MAVA does a lot of work in the volunteer sector, and one of the pieces that we do is research in the field. And so a lot of that comes from our members coming to us and saying, hey, we need more information on this or this. We've done research on skills-based volunteering and short-term volunteering and boomer volunteer engagement. And one of the things that was happening 5-6 years ago, and clearly before that, was a lot of our members were coming to us and saying, our volunteers don't reflect the racial diversity of the communities that we're serving. And we know that's a problem, but we're not really sure what to do about it. And we didn't really have answers. And so that's where this work started, really trying to look at how can we do a better job of engaging BIPOC volunteers, of understanding that experience and really bringing a more diverse cohort of volunteers to our programs. So we started in about 2017, began focusing on cities, worked into nonprofits, and I've been working really closely with an inclusive volunteerism task force and other collaborators and partners. I identify as a white woman, so I do not have the lived experience of being a person of color, and it's been really essential for me to collaborate with a wide variety of people who have different experiences and are able to share their own perspectives. And that is a huge part of this work and of MAVA's work, is bringing together those perspectives and learnings and sharing them with our members and with the field. So our work started focusing a little bit more on inclusion. So what are some small changes we can make? How can we make our programs, our recruitment efforts more inclusive? But in the last couple of years, we've really focused on race equity, which means that we're focusing more on the systems. I recognize that the systems by which we engage volunteers are structurally racist. And so we need to look at those systems. And it's not just about changing your messaging when you're recruiting, but in fact about looking at the whole way in which you're engaging volunteers. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I should mention too that my work as equity and inclusion manager has really been focused on racial equity. So I fully recognize there are so many different aspects of equity that are all equally important. My work is focused on race equity, so that's what I'm going to be talking about and focusing on here today. Okay, so I want to kick it off with some norms for courageous conversations. We're not really going to be interacting with each other today, but I share these because I think they are a really important way to start these dialogues, particularly as you start talking with more people at your organization or in your community about this work. And I think sometimes we go into it feeling really intimidated of, well, what if someone says something wrong and how do I deal with that? And what if people are uncomfortable? And this has really helped me to kind of just start those dialogues with a common understanding. And there are lots of different kind of templates or things that you can use. This is one that I really like, and I just want to kind of demonstrate that for you. So the first piece is stay engaged. And it's really easy for us to, when we start to feel uncomfortable or don't agree with something, to just kind of pull back, especially virtually. You know, it's so easy to be like, I'm not sure what's going on. I'm going to check my Facebook. I'm going to check my email. Oh, I better respond to that. And all of a sudden you're just kind of out of the conversation. So I really invite you today to stay engaged, even when you're not sure how to move forward with the information. The second piece is speak your truth. And that has kind of two parts. One is speak from your own experience, but also be mindful to not speak for others. So you have one lived experience, everyone has one lived experience. And it's important that you speak from that experience and speak the truth of that experience, and also listen to others when they share their truths. The next one is no fixing. And this is something that can be really hard to do sometimes, because when we see someone who is upset or angry, we really want to fix that. And we want to say, oh, you know, the person who said that to you, they didn't mean that. Or, you know, that's not really what they intended. But that's not necessarily helpful. And so really being intentional about not fixing things, but just sitting with the fact that sometimes there's trauma that's caused, and there's discomfort, and there's harm. And we need to recognize that and sit with that and not fix it, because it can't always be fixed right away. The next one is experience discomfort. This is a big one, because as we have these conversations, inevitably there are things that come up that you think, oh man, I was a part of that. My bias reflected this decision that I made, or when I did this, you know, I've been a part of that. We've all been a part of it. We're all part of these systems, and it's uncomfortable when you realize the part that you played in that. But I invite you to sit with that discomfort, and instead of staying engaged, instead of checking out, really stay engaged and understand that discomfort is part of this process, and it's okay, even though it's not fun. It's a necessary part of having these conversations. The next one is take risks. And that's just to say that, you know, if you're okay with it, share what your experiences are. Ask the questions that you're not sure if you should ask, and, you know, put yourself out there, because that's an important part of this as well. Listen for understanding is one that's really, really important. As humans, very often when we're listening, we're crafting our response. And particularly when we were talking about race equity and about our work in volunteer engagement around inclusion and equity, it's important to just listen and listen to people's experiences and understand, again, that we all have different experiences, and the only way to really understand someone else's experience is to listen and sit with it, and not be trying to craft a response or fix it or make it better. And then the last thing is expect and accept non-closure. We have an hour today. We are not going to fix the problems of structural racism in volunteer engagement. It's not going to happen. So you're going to leave without all the answers. In fact, you might leave with more questions than answers, and that's okay. So expect that, accept that, and be okay with these types of conversations, not always leaving you feeling like you know more or you know how to move forward. A lot of it is about just understanding others and getting more information and building new perspectives together. Okay, so I'm going to kick off the idea of one right way. So some of you might be familiar with Tim Okun and Kenneth Jones's work around the characteristics of white supremacy culture. It's amazing work that you should definitely look into if you haven't. But one of the characteristics that has really kind of gotten to me as something that happens a lot in volunteer engagement is the idea of one right way. And the way that Okun and Jones define this is the belief that there is one right way to do things. And once people are introduced to the right way, they will see the light and adopt it. And the thing that's interesting about this is I know that we don't often go around, just saying, hey, there's one right way to do things. This is the one right way to do things. Because I think, often our colleagues would say, oh, that's kind of closed-minded. There's not one right way to do things. However, what we do and say is that's a best practice. And I think that these concepts are really similar. It's just that one has been professionalized and is okay to use. So best practice is a procedure that has been shown by research and experience to produce optimal results and that is established or proposed as a standard suitable for widespread adoption. So I'm going to flip back to one right way, the belief that there is one right way to do things, and once people are introduced to the right way, they will see the light and adopt it. Honestly, I think these are really similar. And I know I personally have used the term best practice a ton in my career. And best practices aren't inherently bad, but you also have to recognize what it means to have a best practice and who it lives out. And so the problem with best practices is we often don't stop to ask best practices for whom? Because one right way and best practices are very often established by and for people with privilege. And that very often is by and for affluent white people. And so you have to think about who has the power. Who gets to say what a best practice is? Who gets to say what that one right way is? Because very often that best practice works for that group of people, but it doesn't work for everyone else. And honestly, it's pretty short-sighted to think that there's one right way that could work for every person in our country or in our world. And I think once you kind of take a step back from that concept, you realize that it is a little bit ridiculous thinking, oh yeah, one right way can work for everyone, or this best practice can work for everyone. The thing that's really important to recognize is that best practices often don't work well for the very communities being supported by our programs. Because again, best practices are often established by people who have power, influence, who have money, and those are not the people that we're supporting in our programs. And so best practices, in addition to being exclusionary, exclude the very people that we're trying to engage with. So I want to talk a little bit about how I've seen this show up in volunteer engagement. This is not a comprehensive list by any means, but just to give you kind of an idea of some of the ways that you might maybe have seen this happening. One way is volunteer onboarding. And this is one of the ways where I think it shows up the most. Most organizations that I've worked with have a very standard procedure of onboarding volunteers. It's express interest, fill out the application, do an interview, do an orientation, do a background check, do training. I mean, it's a multi-step process in order to become a volunteer. There are a lot of hoops that people need to jump through. And that is one thing that works well for people who kind of feel like, well, this volunteer opportunity, I want to do something that not just anyone could do. I want to have to jump through hoops to do my volunteer opportunity because I really want them to utilize my skills. And I don't want just anyone to be able to do this. Otherwise, it's not worth my time. But it doesn't necessarily work well for someone who just wants to help in their community. And what you see very often in BIPOC communities is people are helping one another all the time. They're just not doing it through nonprofit organizations because nonprofit organizations put up all these barriers. And I'll mention this a little bit later, but MAVA has been doing some listening sessions with BIPOC volunteers to learn more about the structural barriers within volunteerism. And one of the things we've heard a lot is, I'm here in the Twin Cities, and after George Floyd's murder, people just assembled. And congregated and, sent out a message on Facebook and said, we need food at this corner, and people showed up. You didn't have to fill out an application. You didn't have to do a background check. You didn't even have to sign in. You could just help where that help was needed. And that's not something that we do in nonprofits. We make it a process. And even though sometimes there are different, maybe there's a different system for onboarding if someone's an episodic volunteer or a short-term volunteer. Usually it's kind of the same type of process. And that's something that we need to revisit, because if you look at, at least with most of the organizations I work with, if you look at who that process works for, it's primarily privileged white volunteers. And that's who goes through the process and becomes a volunteer. So the next piece is in recruiting new volunteers. And this one, I hesitated to put on at first because I think that volunteer engagement leaders are super, super creative in how they recruit volunteers. But there is one thing that is similar across recruitment, and that usually is that someone has to identify themselves as a volunteer in order to find your opportunities. So, in order to be looking on Volunteer Match or looking on your website for volunteer opportunities, they need to say, I want to volunteer, and I'm going to look for a volunteer opportunity. But what we don't always realize is that volunteer in and of itself is a loaded word, and not everyone sees themselves as a volunteer. In some cases, volunteerism is associated with bad experiences of white saviorism and people coming into a community and doing more harm than good. The word volunteer doesn't even have a direct translation in a lot of languages. So it's that word in and of itself is a barrier and affects who sees themselves as a volunteer. And if you say, oh, do you want to volunteer with us? Some people might say, well, that's not for me. I can't work without being paid because I'm working 2 jobs already. Whereas other people might say, yeah, volunteering is a good thing for the community. And so recognizing that and realizing that in order to bridge that gap, you need to build relationships, and you need to be talking to people, learning about their interests, and invite them to partner with your organization, to be involved with your organization, and not necessarily just jumping in and saying, do you want to volunteer? Because not everyone is going to say, yeah, I'm a volunteer, because there's a long history to who volunteers and what that word means. The next piece that I think is really important is goal setting. And this is not entirely on you as volunteer engagement leaders. Actually, a lot of it isn't on you, but I still think it's something we can push back on. I can get on my soapbox about this one, so I'll try not to get too out there. But so often our goals are put in this timeline. It's usually 1 year. Our reviews, as volunteer engagement leaders or as nonprofit professionals, they're once a year. And the truth is, this work around dismantling inequities and building relationships, it doesn't happen in a year. It happens over many years. And it's really hard to measure. You hear about SMART goals, and I forget what all the letters stand for, but I know M is measurable. And sometimes this work isn't measurable. How do you measure a relationship? If I were to go to a supervisor, in one of my previous roles and say, oh, my goal this year is to strengthen my relationship with this person, they'd say, well, how are you going to measure that? Well, I can't really measure that, but that's what this work is about. And so I think it's really short-sighted that so often our goals are focused on metrics and are focused on a really time-bound period, usually of a year or less, when it's not realistic to do that, to do this work in that amount of time. One thing that I think we can do is try and kind of break down some of the the goals that we have and the things we want to do. So for example, I've told people, you know, if you really want to engage with and build relationships with some new BIPOC communities that your organization is serving, maybe your goal is to reach out to 10 new contacts. And then what you hope is that maybe 3 of those will turn into relationships. So you can put numbers around it, but try and be broad and try and make sure that you focus first on what it is you really want to accomplish, and then kind of work back and say, well, how can I set up goals that would support that? It's not perfect, but I know that we live in a world where we have time-bound goals, and very often as volunteer engagement leaders, our jobs and our pay and everything is associated with that. And so we can't ignore the fact that that's what we're evaluated on. And it doesn't jive with what this work is, and with building relationships and dismantling inequities. So the next piece I'm going to talk about is volunteer training. And this is just a brief thing that I want folks to think about, but very often for one particular position, we would have a volunteer do the same training, regardless of who that volunteer is. It's fair, it's how we ensure that everyone has what they need. But I think it's really important as you look at recruiting and engaging more volunteers who have different lived experiences, you really need to value those lived experiences and understand how they contribute to the volunteer experience. And so if you're making a point of doing trainings about the history of the neighborhood with your volunteers, maybe your volunteers from outside of the neighborhood need that, but the volunteers who come from inside the neighborhood do not need that. And it's okay to require different things of different people based on their lived experiences and based on what they know and what they're able to do. And so remembering that, the difference between the concepts of equality, which is everyone gets the same thing, versus equity, which is everyone gets what they need. And keeping that in mind when we're designing trainings so that it's not one size fits all in terms of training for a particular position. And the last thing is measuring volunteer value. Sue Carter-Call has done a lot of work around this, so hopefully you've read some of her work. But, a lot of times we use the independent sector value of this is how much, an hour of volunteering is worth. And we put that out there for our donors, of course, and our staff and our board and our volunteers. But I really challenge you to think about who is that number meaningful for? I know for me as a volunteer, it's not super significant to hear, oh, volunteers contributed $1 million of time to the organization this year. But particularly if you are a volunteer who lives in and supports the community that the organization supports, hearing that volunteers contributed $1 million of volunteer time may in fact make you kind of resentful of like, well, why aren't we seeing that result here in the community where my neighbors have needs and they're not for someone to go in and volunteer, they're for someone to give them food. So recognizing that and that perspective shift, and how do we talk about volunteerism and the effect of volunteerism, the impact? And I think the answer to that is really looking at storytelling and just those individual stories, and how can we tell those stories to tell about the impact that is being made on lives as opposed to impact in terms of these kind of quantifiable things that maybe aren't really meaningful to the very communities that we're serving and to the volunteers who are doing that work. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a minute here. If we were a smaller group, I'd do a discussion, but what I want to do is ask all of you this question. And if you want, you can pop your answer into the chat. But I invite you to bring this question actually back to your volunteer engagement teams and to your nonprofits, because I think this is an important place to start when we're having these conversations. So the question is, how have you seen one right way or best practices show up as a barrier to racial equity in volunteer engagement? So I want to give you a minute to think about that. And I'm going to open up the chat. I mean, I think it's open already. I'm going to open it on my screen and see if anyone has ideas around this. Background checks, it is 100%. And the thing about background checks is it doesn't only exclude people who have criminal histories, it also excludes anyone who has a fear of government, which is very, very prevalent in a lot of immigrant communities right now. So it's a huge barrier and it affects more people than you may think originally. Someone who needs to be a documented citizen for a background check. Yep, exactly. Not everyone can even undergo a background check, depending on what system you use and if they are a citizen or not. Only being able to access volunteer roles online, so passive recruitment. Again, you have to say, I'm a volunteer and I want to volunteer to be able to find those volunteer roles. Background checks again, access to computers to complete orientation. That is so true. And I think as we've dealt with the pandemic and we've seen so much move to virtual, we've seen a lot of barriers removed, but there are also more barriers being put up because not everyone has reliable internet access or computers or has enough bandwidth to support, their 4 kids who are learning from home and, 2 adults trying to work from home. It's hard and that puts up its own barriers, which we can't do as much about right now, but once we are able to convene in person, how can you make that more accessible to everyone? Sorry, I'm just trying to read through a few of these. These are great. A sense of organizational perfectionism to white staff standards in regard to how volunteers show up and do their work. Yep. I just saw an article about how professionalism is a tool of white supremacy culture. And I think that's absolutely true because what we look at as professional is the standards that, it's the one right way of being professional that very often have been established by privileged, powerful white people. Dress codes goes into that. Lack of diversity in images, voices, opinions in our recruitment materials, requiring all volunteers to be on site for orientation on digital registration. Yeah, absolutely. Transportation is a huge issue too. Not everyone has their own car and not everyone has a car at all. And depending on what city you're in, here in the Twin Cities, people do rely a lot on personal transportation, but there's buses and it's, you have to think about where are we located and can people get to us easily? That's a huge factor. I'm gonna stop reading the chat for now. And I'm not gonna pause for questions yet. I see there's a couple of them, but I'm gonna keep going and then I'll come back to questions in a bit. So yeah, so there's a lot of ways and I encourage you to just keep thinking about this in terms of, how am I seeing this show up at my organization? How am I seeing this show up in my work and get other people to think about it too, because there are so many ways. And very often they're embedded in kind of how we think of, this is the way we do volunteer engagement. And until we move away from that and that idea that there's this one right way to do things, we're going to be stuck within systems that are problematic. So this is not a full solution to this all, but one thing that I think we all really need to work on is rediscovering our creativity. Because this idea of best practices and one right way, it really stifles that creativity because it tells us, okay, this has been researched, this is all good, this is the way you do things, and you don't need to think about it anymore. And honestly, that's not true. We do need to think about it more. And if we do spend more time thinking about it and not getting stuck in this one right way of doing things, we can come up with some pretty amazing solutions together. And some of them are going to be easier and some of them are going to be a lot harder. But the biggest thing is allowing ourselves to rediscover this creativity and get out of that mindset of that won't work when approaching new ideas, because that's another piece of this one right way. Is your initial reaction when you've got this embedded in your brain is when someone proposes a new idea, oh, that couldn't work. That won't work. How would we protect our organization's liability? How would we do this? How would we make sure our volunteers have a good experience? All of these things. And we need to move past that and really embrace creativity and think, okay, but what if we did try it? And so I encourage you to don't think outside the box, because the box itself is even limiting. Because as soon as we think of something as being outside the box, we say, well, I don't see how that could work. But throw the box away or recycle it or blow it up or whatever, whatever you want to do, take the puppy out first, but throw it away and get rid of that box, because that box is holding us back. And that box is stifling our creativity. And that box is telling us that there's one way that we do things. And that's how it has to be. And as long as we're stuck in that box in that one right way, we are still going to be working within a racist system that is catering to people with privilege. And that's not where volunteerism needs to be. So an important first step is starting by building relationships and listening to voices from the communities you want to engage. I've been really fortunate in the past year. MAVA got some grant funding to be able to do listening sessions with BIPOC volunteers. And because of the grant funding, we were able to pay those volunteers, which is essentially, I mean, it's so critically important. You know, we pay people for so many things. We pay people for their skills in graphic design and for their fundraising skills. Yet when we bring someone in to talk about their own lived experiences and potentially share trauma and harmful things in their past, we think that they should do that for free. And that's, they shouldn't. You know, you need to pay people for sharing their experiences and recognize that that's an asset that someone can bring to your organization, to your work, and it's valuable. And the way that we express value in our society, like it or not, is through money. So we've been really fortunate to be able to pay the participants and just get an idea, just hear from a variety of voices around, you know, how do you volunteer? What do you think of when you hear the word volunteer? What barriers are there to volunteering, and how do you perceive those barriers? And what would volunteering look like in an ideal world for you? So MAVA is going to be coming out with a report around this later this year. And so we're still in the midst actually of these listening sessions. But one of the important first steps is really talking with and listening to the people you want to engage, because that is the only way that you're going to bring in new perspectives and learn about how best to engage people who aren't currently engaged with your organization. And so again, we have that box that very often limits our thinking, but instead of, oh, we can't, you know, saying we can't do that, try, okay, maybe we can't, but what would it look like if we did? Start with the end game. What would it look like if we did? And can we work backwards and think of how we might be able to make that work? Instead of thinking that could never work, try, okay, maybe I can't think of a way that it would work, but how can we co-create it so that it would work? And instead of saying, you know, you just don't understand how volunteerism works. You know, I'm a volunteer engagement professional. I get these systems and these best practices. Instead of saying, you don't understand this, try, I need to better understand how you help your community so that we can work together to make this work for everyone. And so really stepping away from those initial reactions that are based on doing things one right way and being open to new ideas, new voices, and the idea of co-creating with people who have different experiences, different assets, and are able to bring a new perspective to the work that you're doing. So as I mentioned, we've been doing these listening sessions. They're currently in process. We've had 31 participants so far. We've had 65% Black or African American, 24% Latinx, and 80% have been women. And then 75% have said that they volunteered with a group or a nonprofit. And this has been limited to Minnesota. It's a grant from the Minneapolis Foundation. So, you know, we've been focusing on Minneapolis. But I think it's important to share some of the things that we've learned, just some of the initial findings. And this information doesn't replace doing listening sessions or building partnerships in your own community, but I think gives you an idea of how important it is to do this work and build these relationships. So one of the things that I think is really telling is how do you or would you get connected to volunteer opportunities? And the number one way was heard about it from friend or family. And so when you think about the ways in which we recruit volunteers, you can't hear about it from a friend or family if that person isn't in your network. And who are we asking to recruit volunteers? Who are our current volunteers? Who are our staff members? Who are the people who advocate for our organizations? The first step is to start building relationships with the communities that you want to engage, because that's how word of mouth is going to happen. And that's how you're going to start building trust in those communities between your organization and people being served. or simply people from a different background than most of your volunteers. So it's really important to think about that, and how can you focus on building those relationships, both on behalf of yourself and behalf of the organization. The second piece was learning about it at a community event. So again, these aren't volunteer fairs, these are community events. And this is something that's really important, because often I've heard volunteer engagement leaders say, I've gone to community events, but we haven't really gotten any volunteers from those, so we stopped going. And that, again, is a results-oriented approach. If you go to a community cultural festival, or even, if you're in a more rural community, a farmer's market, or anywhere that draws a really diverse array of people, the first step is being there and being present. And maybe you're not going to recruit volunteers the first time, but maybe you're going to tell a few people about your organization. And over time, you're going to start to build that trust and build that relationship. And so you have to recognize that going one time to some sort of community event is probably not going to yield results, because again, building relationships is really hard to measure. And so being patient with that and recognizing that showing up is a big deal. And that's part of this work and part of this process. And so then you can see it's not until the third one that's the organization's on website or online volunteer opportunities. So again, thinking about how do we reach out to people and how important relationships are, which I think is underemphasized in volunteer recruitment, because so often it's about how do we create the right messaging, where do we put the recruitment messages out, as opposed to how do we attract people who don't know about our organization, may not think of themselves as a volunteer, but would be the best volunteer we could have, because they would bring things that we don't have right now. So I want to read just a few quotes from some of the listening session participants, because I think these have really kind of blown my mind in terms of thinking about this in new ways. So the first one is, I don't get why only certain people can volunteer. Certain people aren't good enough to help you, even if it's something they care about. Systems don't appeal to me because they push people out and push people away. And I know for me in previous roles, I never thought of the systems as pushing people away. I thought of them as protecting the organization. And it's really important to recognize that systems do push people out and push people away. And sometimes the fact that those systems exist deter people from engaging with your organization. And the next one is, people would be more willing to do things if barriers weren't in place, making sure that services are provided for people to be alleviated of the burden that prevents them from being able to do it. Can be a reciprocal thing. We need volunteers. If you believe in our values and want to be a part, let's have a conversation about what you need. Find solutions together so that person does get the opportunity to volunteer. And this one, I think, is such an important shift in thinking, because how often do we sit down with a volunteer and say, okay, what do you need in order to volunteer with our organization? That's simply not something that I have seen done a lot. And if you're doing it, oh my gosh, good for you. But I don't see this being done a lot. I see a lot of it as the volunteer needs to fit with what the organization needs, as opposed to the organization finding a way to remove barriers for the volunteer. What if we approached volunteer engagement in this way? How can we allow you to volunteer? How can we make sure you get the opportunity to volunteer? What do we need to provide? I think that would be a really, really good start. So just to kind of build off of that, a few things that volunteers shared in terms of where they do volunteer is through churches or faith-based communities. There's a lot of trust in those organizations, and a lot of history, a lot of family relationships. And and honestly, after having some of the conversations, after listening to some of the conversations, I was like, we should just give all of our money to the Black church, because they can fix anything and they'll take care of everyone, and maybe we should just do that. And of course, that's not what's really happening, but there's a lot of great work being done in those organizations, and it's very community driven. Another place is through BIPOC-led organizations and groups. I heard a lot of people say, I don't trust white-led organizations. I have had bad experiences. I don't find them to be welcoming and inclusive. I just don't want to deal with the harm that I think will come from being involved with them. Another way, I mentioned this earlier, but informally helping in the community and neighborhood. There was one listening session participant who said, I don't volunteer with organizations, but I think it's important that my daughters see us helping. And so they would go through their neighborhood and pick up trash. And she said, not everyone thinks that my neighborhood is a great place, but I think that it's wonderful and I want to keep it clean and I want to show people that it's a wonderful place to live. And that was how she contributed to her community, not through any organization. And she said, I probably couldn't volunteer with an organization because I'm taking care of my kids and I'm working and I couldn't fit with the schedule, but this is something I can do. And then showing up when there's a need, just showing up and bringing food and bringing supplies and helping neighbors, helping people when there's a need is a huge way that volunteerism happens in BIPOC communities and with BIPOC volunteers. And then finally at nonprofits where they've been involved or received services. So that's another thing where if someone has received services through your organization, you've kind of built a relationship with them. And if it was a good experience, they might be willing to contribute as a volunteer. We had one listening session participant who had been tutored through an organization. And then she said, I talked to them about volunteering and they really made it clear that English didn't need to be my first language and I just needed to come as I was and I could help. And so she did. And she's a tutor now with that organization that helped her get her GED. And I think that's really cool because that organization I worked with pretty closely and they were really, really intentional about their messaging and trying to make sure that their messaging was inclusive of people of all backgrounds, all skill levels, all proficiencies in English. They made it really intentional of you don't need to be a teacher. You just need to be able to speak some English and you just need to be willing to help. And that helped them to recruit a lot more volunteers who reflected the community they were serving because people didn't think, I need a bachelor's degree. I need to be a teacher. This isn't something I can't do. Because the recruitment messages were really focused on, you don't need any training. We will provide everything you need. You just need to be willing. Okay, so I'm gonna post this question here. And this is again one for you. You can pop something into the chat if you want, but one for you to take back to your volunteer teams or even, if you're part of a local DOVIA or ABA, something to talk about. Have you tried or experienced creative outside the box ways of engaging volunteers? And how did this creativity break down barriers? So I'd love to hear, if you want to put in the chat, if anyone has had experience with these types of activities, if you've done something that has been effective, if you've kind of moved away from one right way and found, wow, we really didn't need to do it that one way. I'm just watching the chat to see if anyone pops anything. And this is a little bit harder because it's been a little bit further along in this work, but sometimes people do it unintentionally and realize after the fact, oh, I didn't realize I was removing a barrier when we just tried to make things easier. Reading here, open the door to virtual volunteers. We have new volunteers from different religious backgrounds who now interact with the deaf community. That's awesome. Yeah, I think one of the things about COVID that just continually strikes me is how quickly we change. There are so many things that we say, oh, this takes so long to change, and then a pandemic hits and all of a sudden we're all working from home and we're engaging volunteers virtually. And you know what? It didn't take that long to change. And I think if we learn anything from our current situation, it's that if you have to, you can make changes. And it's amazing how allowing virtual volunteer opportunities has broken down barriers. Created shorter 1 hour commitments, 142% increase in volunteers, but 25% decrease in productivity or hours. Yeah. I mean, who is able to come in for 3 hours or multiple times a week? That I've said before in other trainings, being able to prioritize your volunteer opportunity as the top thing that you're doing is a luxury. And that is why, at least in the organizations that I have worked at, we've seen a lot of early retirees, affluent, privileged early retirees, and they're wonderful volunteers. But there's a reason that we're getting that group, and it's that we ask a lot of volunteers, and people have lives outside of volunteerism, and we have to allow for that, and we have to embrace that and celebrate it. We provided public transportation passes for volunteers so that they could use for other non-volunteer trips as well. Yes, transportation is a barrier. And very often, it's like, well, how can we ensure that they only use it for volunteering? Well, do you have to? Maybe that's a benefit of volunteering. Along the lines of virtual volunteering, using accessibility accommodations like Zoom closed captioning for telephone reference-friendly visiting volunteers with hearing impairments to support their volunteerism. Absolutely. Yeah, these are all great. I'm going to leave it off here, but I encourage you to keep sharing these. So, some of these are pretty small. Some of them are bigger, but recognizing that there are small things you can do, there are big things you can do. But if you can break down some of these barriers, it does really make a difference. And sometimes in order to even recognize the barriers, you have to start thinking outside the box or throwing away the box or however you want to talk about it. So to give you just a little bit of an idea of kind of what this could look like, creating different pathways to volunteering and not upholding one as the best way. So maybe you don't have to get rid of the application background checked way that you have of volunteering for some positions. If you're working with vulnerable populations, if you're working with kids, yeah, people need a background check. I get that. But maybe not every position at your organization needs a background check. And maybe some positions people can just show up and help out and leave. Are there different ways for people to engage? Are there ways that people can engage and come as they are and come from whatever they're coming from and feel like they're engaged with the organization? Working alongside communities to co-create new ideas. This is particularly for white-led organizations. This whole problem of one right way came from white people trying to create one right way for everyone. And so you can't do this work in a vacuum or in a silo. You need to work in conjunction with the communities you're serving, and you need to have a process of co-creation, and you need to bring those communities into your organization as staff and volunteers. Building internal culture around equity. This is really important because you can do all the right things in terms of recruitment, but if your internal culture doesn't uphold being a welcoming and inclusive environment, volunteers are going to leave. So understanding that there needs to be education. People need to have an understanding of white supremacy culture and of microaggressions and of implicit bias, all these different all these different realities that need to really be at the center of your work and really personally improving, but also organizationally breaking down barriers. Except that building relationships does not follow the same timeline as organizational goals. So I mentioned this earlier, but even if you recognize it for yourself and realize, my goals are for the next 3 years, I have to break them down into goals for 1 year. But I know that I'm not going to see, any organization who says, oh, we want to see a 10% increase in BIPOC volunteers over the next year, that's ridiculous, because it just doesn't happen that way. This work is about building relationships, and relationships don't happen in that time frame. And so I would really encourage you to push back against that type of thinking and focus on longer term results that are based on system change and building those relationships. Partnering with groups that have earned the trust of the community. Can you build relationships with local churches, with BIPOC sororities or fraternities, with groups that do have the trust of BIPOC volunteers? Can you partner with them, build trust with those groups, and then find a way to connect and work together to meet the needs of the community? And of course, these are not all encompassing. So I have what else? So my hope is that this just gets you thinking. One, recognizing that we are very often stuck in this one right way, and that we don't have to be. and that the first step is recognizing it and then really allowing ourselves to embrace creativity and just throw away that box. And this is a quote from Maya Angelou that has really helped guide me in this work. And it's, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And this has helped me because I'm a person that I want to know everything before I take action. And that it's never realistic, but it's particularly not realistic when you're doing equity work, because it is a journey and it is a lifetime journey. And if I waited until I knew everything and knew I could do it perfectly, I would never do anything. And the important thing here is start the work, because you're going to make mistakes and you're going to find out things that you didn't know. But then when you know better, you can do better, and give yourself that permission and know that doing the best you can is all you can do for now, but continue the journey and continue to learn and grow so that when you know better, you can do better. So with that, I'll put my email up there. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm happy to take questions. And please do feel free to reach out to me if you have questions, or if I can point you in the direction of resources or work that MAVA's done or other organizations. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions. I'll unshare my screen. Oh, Faiza just said, when I say white lead, what do I mean? Sorry, I'm toggling some screens here. So white lead, what I mean by that is organizations whose primary leadership is made up of white people. So a lot of times you go on an organization's website and you see they have a commitment to diversity, great, but then you go and look at all of the leaders and they're all white. So that's primarily what I mean by white lead. Some people would refer to more if they were kind of created by white people to kind of help those less fortunate. But I think at this point, there are some organizations that were maybe, historically had been white led, but are now doing a good job of really embracing diversity and equity. But for the most part, by white led, I just mean that most of the power within those organizations rests within white people.
Lisa, this is Gretchen. Here's a question. Do you have advice for identifying organizations to build relationships with? This is time consuming and we cannot accommodate all orgs that approach us. And also have a request for your email address. And I'll put in the chat box while you're talking. Okay.
And I'm going to send the slides to Gretchen afterwards, so you'll get my slides and my email is in there. So yeah, identifying groups to build relationships with. I'm going to be honest, it is super hard right now with the pandemic, because building relationships online is really difficult. The only way that this pandemic has helped with relationships is I have been able to build relationships with people who are not local, and that's wonderful. But other than that, I mean, it's hard to authentically build relationships on the phone or over the computer. So I would say, do what you can, while we're still not meeting in person. But when we are able to meet in person, that's when to really pick up this work. And the biggest thing I would say, there's a lot of things you can do. One is, look at your geographic area and the communities you're serving, and look for organizations or churches or groups that are BIPOC led, that people are engaging with, and reach out. And I can do a whole training on kind of what authentic relationships looks like, and I won't do that, but reaching out to those groups and just trying to learn more about them and approaching it with an idea of reciprocity. So not just, hey, can I talk to you about how to get volunteers from your organization, but can we talk about, how you serve the community and what we do with the community, and maybe we can help one another. Another thing is cultural events and festivals. Again, not happening right now, but I have heard from a number of people that, like, if you have a booth or a vendor booth at a cultural celebration or festival, the first year you're going to have some conversations. The second year, you're going to have a few more conversations. And over time, people start to think of you as part of that community, and you start to build trust. And that's a way of showing up. And you think about who shows up, and that's important. So showing up to those types of events is another important thing. Will give you the opportunity to interact with people who are interested in your mission, who may be interested in learning more. So those are a couple ways. It's not, that's one of the hardest parts really, is figuring out where to start. But I would say just start reaching out and keep that idea of reciprocity in mind, of how can we find a relationship that's going to benefit both of us.
Thank you, Lisa. We also had a question from a couple slides ago. What's the difference between informally helping in a community versus showing up when there's a need?
There's not that huge of a difference. The biggest thing I would say informally helping is neighbors just helping neighbors. So, and you see this, I mean, it's super prevalent in BIPOC communities where one of my task force members is like, yeah, my mom grew up volunteering at church, but she never called it volunteering. But she was at church every Sunday and Saturday and Wednesday. And so it's kind of this ongoing informal helping. It also could be, just people, shopping for their neighbors or giving someone a ride to the doctor. In a lot of communities, BIPOC communities and immigrant communities in particular, there's, very close-knit extended families. And so maybe one person has a car and, that person is continually, running errands and driving people to the doctor. And so it's kind of that ongoing informal, whereas showing up when there's a need is more event-based, where, for example, after George Floyd's murder, when there were people who didn't have access to food because their grocery store had been burned down, people showed up and brought food and brought diapers and distributed those. Similar, if there's a death, a lot of people show up with food and everything that's needed for a funeral and to celebrate that person's life. So it's more the ongoing versus event-based is how I would differentiate those.
Perfect, thank you. I'm going to switch real quick to our announcement slide, and then we will, I'm not going to switch because it doesn't want me to. Hold on, guys. I'm going to stop sharing and share it again. There we go. Nope. There we are. All right, everyone. Apologies for our tech glitches today. We'll get back to questions in just a minute, but I wanted to let you all know to save the date for the next Alive Academy webinars. March 3rd, Beth Steinhorn is going to be presenting on navigating difficult situations, effective solutions for everyday challenges. April 23rd, Emily Bromett-Bauer, Nicole Smith, and myself will present on making it personal, building inclusion in your volunteer corps. We'll talk about practical exercises, success stories, and cautionary tales. May 12th, Alana Napau will be presenting on saying no to the wrong things so we can say yes to the right things. She's going to do a deep dive into personal advocacy for all of us. I'd like to let you all know that we are still seeking a presenter for a diversity, equity, accessibility, or inclusion topic for October 2021, and presenters on any topic for the Alive Academy in 2022. If you have something you'd like to see, perhaps you are the person should bring your lived experience forward and contribute to this. And lastly, volunteer positions at Alive are always open. We want you to make a difference in your field. We'd love it if you joined us, if you presented, anything that would work for you. And if you're thinking about presenting, or if you have a topic you're interested in, but you're not sure that you're the right person to do it, I will happily workshop that webinar with you, find you a presenter, whatever it is that I can get you all to share your lived experience, we will do. As always, you can find more information on the website. This is how to contact myself and Gretchen. Ooh, and I'm seeing things in the chat, hold that thought. So I'll leave this up for a moment. Yep, not going to see the chat, I guess, while I'm sharing my screen. Don't know why. Yeah, Lisa, any last remarks as we're nearly at the top of the hour?
No, just thank you for having me, and please feel free to reach out if you have questions or feedback or ideas. MAVA is continuing to do this work, and we would be happy to hear from you.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm so excited for this topic to continue and for us to all share our experience, but continue this work forward. It's not just the events of last year. We have to keep talking about this, keep learning, keep sharing, and keep moving this forward.
This is Gretchen, and just a couple of quick responses before I end is that I don't believe the April session is about military volunteering.
It is not.
Okay, thank you very much. And if you do have further questions, I'm sure you could contact Lisa for quick questions, but remember that Alive will be having a whole series of webinars regarding these topics. And again, this isn't something we can fix in an hour, so we've just got to keep doing the work and maybe having some of those uncomfortable conversations. So again, I would like to thank Lisa for her time and insight today, and want to wish everybody a great rest of the week. And we will end here, and hopefully we'll see you at next month's Alive Academy.